people were panicked. They were taking their money out of the banks and they weren't spending. And so businesses, they saw their sales falling, but they weren't allowed to lower their wages. And so that's why unemployment got so high. So in earlier depressions with a small d, you still had falling prices, but wages fell too. So they were bad times, but unemployment didn't get nearly as high as it did under Hoover with his allegedly compassionate policies.
Now, you talk about not having or letting the market determine, let's say, the recovery or make a reparation for itself. And according to history, 9,000 or so banks, financial institutions in the 1930s failed as a result of the Great Depression. But many of these were standalone banks. These were owned by individuals or groups of persons, and they had to some extent no real relationship or connection or connectivity with each other. But that's not the case today. People like you criticize the government for going in and shoring up the banks so that they don't fail and making sure that they have the kind of capitalization that they need and find ways to encourage them to start lending again, because the American and the world economy runs on credit. But today, those banks are very much interconnected. That what is happening in New York or in South Carolina is affecting what happens in the Bahamas and Trinidad and China and so on and so forth. Still don't think that stimulus or some capitalization effort was necessary for those banks or financial institutions.
Well, no, I don't think in the long run it's a good idea, because you're not fixing the fundamental problem. I mean, those banks are still all technically insolvent, or many of them are, and they're just being propped up because the Fed's buying what's called toxic assets, and the Fed's holding those mortgage-backed securities on its books, and so those banks now are solvent. But if the Fed reverses course, instantly they're going to be insolvent again. So it's not that the banking sector in the U.S. is healthy now, it's just on life support. And I think it's going to get fixed if now it's dependent on government handouts. I think if they had just stepped back and literally done nothing, yeah, a few big banks would have failed. That might have caused severe problems around the world for a few months, but people would have adjusted, and that would be a memory at this point. Whereas now we're still in the midst of this, and this recession's been going on since officially December of 2007, but I would say much earlier.
Do you feel, now you really feel, Dr. Robert Murphy, that you would have been able to stomach the incredible fallout if you were to just allow the market to fix itself after the bubble bursted with the home and the housing issues? Do you think you could just sit back and watch the absolute misery for 16 weeks or 22 weeks that the world would have had to endure if governments did not do something?
Well, again, I don't know if the political leaders would have had the stomach, and if I were in office, it's certainly easier for me as an outside analyst to say these things. I grant you that, but it's not that the suffering has been avoided. I think it's just been postponed. So I think that we're going to see over the next few years, you're going to have this misery, and unemployment's going to keep getting higher. And so that's not a question of do you want suffering or not. It's do you want to get it over with and have it fall mostly on the shoulders of the people who screwed up during the housing boom, whereas now it's just getting spread around to everybody, that people around the world, their governments are putting them much deeper into debt, even though they had nothing to do with the mistakes of the housing boom years. Bernanke
says that it is going to end, a recession that is, in September to December, anywhere in that area of this year, and that the recovery will start in December, January, February of next year. And we all know that unemployment is the very last statistical tick to show some improvement, and by the end of 2010, you were going to start seeing a rather rosy economic picture for the world once again. Different places will have more rosier picture than others, but for the most part, rosier picture. You don't buy that?
I don't think so. I mean, you can always look at these short-term statistics and things look better or they look worse. But, I mean, Bernanke, he's had a horrible track record. All throughout the stages of when the boom was tapering off and then busting, he kept saying, oh, it's just confined to subprime, don't worry, it's not going to spread to the real economy. He just kept expanding how bad it was going to be when the statistics kept showing him that it was getting worse. And so I don't think, if he didn't see this thing coming, I don't know why we believe him now that he says it's over.
So when do you think that you will see a rosy economic picture for the world? Let's stay to the United States, for the United States again.
Well, it's impossible for me to give a specific figure because I think what's going on is all the things they've done in response, like taking over the banking sector, the car companies. Now they want to largely socialize healthcare. All these things are going to have their toll. And so the question is, are they going to pull back from some of these things? So I think it's going to be awful for the next few years at least.
Years?
Years.
You don't see by the time it's 2011-12, when Mr. Obama goes back to the American people for re-election, if he wishes to do so, that there will be a rather, exciting and favorable economic environment that he can brag about as having possibly engineered or caused to be engineered.
No, I don't think that's at all what's going to happen. I mean, I think things might not seem in terms of a crisis the way right now it still seems like things are in crisis, because I think people will just have adapted to how bad things are. And I think at that point he'll still be able to say, look at how bad things were when I took over, and we averted all these disasters, we changed the trajectory, but by no means do I think we're going to have a great economy 4 years from now.
This is Star 106.5 FM, Nassau, the Bahamas. Now back to Jeffrey on Star 106.5 FM.
Dr. Robert Murphy is our special guest, an economist, having studied at New York University, received his PhD in economics. And what was your thrust doctorally?
Oh, I worked on it was history of economic thought, looking at capital and interest theory.
Oh, quite good. Interest. What did you find out?
I found out that a certain economist named Bumbaver from the late 1800s, that the way his ideas had been interpreted, I thought they were misinterpreted, and so I was just trying to rehabilitate his contribution.
Did you manage to successfully do so? Well, obviously you got your PhD, so somebody believed. Somebody believed you, Doc. I do appreciate it. Where did it start? Where did this particular crisis have its genesis? Can we go back to Ronald Reagan?
Well, you could go back that far. What I think it is, and people ask me, what happened to this? My prime culprit for me is Alan Greenspan.
What happened? So?
Right. That after the 9/11 attacks and the bursting of the dot-com boom, there would have been a recession in the United States in 2001, 2002, but Alan Greenspan brought interest rates way down. I think they were around 6.5%. He brought them down to 1% fairly quickly, and he held them there for a full year at that low rate of 1%. And the idea was that he was giving a soft landing to that recession, and we got through it. And housing, people were amazed that, wow, this for the first time in history, housing prices keep rising amidst the recession. This guy's the maestro. They're actually calling him the maestro. But in retrospect, it looks like what he did was he fueled a housing boom. And so it may have provided a temporary relief from what would have been a moderate recession then, but now it's given us what people are saying is the worst recession since World War II.
But do you think that's fair, Doctor, that you would put it on Alan Greenspan? Everybody else seems to think that it was a lack of regulation. Let me give you an example. People were getting loans for houses who could not qualify for a postage stamp. What did Alan Greenspan have to do with that? In the Bahamas, it could not happen. We have got the Royal Bank of Canada, First Caribbean, Bank of Nova Scotia, all Canadian banks. If you don't meet a certain threshold of some kind, you're not going to get simply that loan. If it isn't somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% down, and if your debt to service ratio is not somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% or something of this nature, they're not going to give you that loan. But you guys in the United States were giving people loans in the neighborhood. They couldn't qualify. So what did Greenspan have to do with that?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and obviously I'm not saying it was solely Greenspan's fault. Plenty of people made mistakes, especially in retrospect. They made boneheaded decisions, but for example, why would a bank, if it's their money, why would they grant a mortgage to someone that they knew didn't really have a job or that they didn't follow up on the sources? And I think the main reason was they knew, well, first of all, many of them were selling off the mortgages to other investment houses, which were then pooling them and chopping them up. But even there, that just pushes back the question, okay, how come those people weren't doing due diligence? Right. And I think the ultimate reason was if the home price